Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the organizers. It's really great to be here, and sorry to those whose talks I had to miss over the course of these 3 days. So I'll start by saying that I am by no means an expert in Kierkegaard. I'm not a scholar of Kierkegaard. I say that not just to anticipate or try to excuse any mistakes I make in interpretation, but also because it's sort of an invitation from everyone to help me try to understand Kierkegaard as well as possible, as charitably as possible, in the context that we're talking about. So, given that I'm not a scholar of Kierkegaard and have not worked much on Kierkegaard in the past, how did I get here? So that's what drew me to Kierkegaard is basically an obsession, maybe an unhealthy obsession that I have had over the past number of years with the topic of systematicity, with the philosophical issue of systematicity, and what is the proper attitude to take toward system building and conversely piecemeal philosophy. I'll sometimes speak about philosophy, sometimes about metaphysics. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, why I'm going back and forth there. But that there was a historical controversy at the turn of the 20th century that seemed to be pretty significant in the development of philosophy in general and analytic philosophy in the 20th century between 19th century idealists and folks like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore and others. On the other hand, surrounding this question of the proper place of systematic philosophizing is sort of, I think, common knowledge. Historians will add all sorts of complexities to the exact story here, and I think probably the true story is slightly more complex than the potted history that many of us are familiar with, but the potted history is close enough to the truth, I think, in this case at least, to be serviceable for us. And so basically, it goes like this. The idealists, starting with German idealists, Hegel, Fichte, and others, and then continuing on with the British idealists, Bradley, McTaggart, and others, they shared in common not only some sort of idealism, not only some sort of monism, but also a broader methodological and epistemological attitude regarding the question of metaphysical system building. And what they held in a nutshell is that it has to be done, has to obviously not just tote cord. I mean, not everyone has to do metaphysical system building, but it has to if one wants to do metaphysics, if one wants to do philosophy at all. But on the other hand, they also held, lo and behold, it works out conveniently. They also held that such a thing was doable, that systems were attainable. Okay, so that's on the one hand. And then you have this revolt in the early 20th century on the part of Bertrand Russell, less explicitly, but still there in G.E. Moore and others, who argued on both of these claims. So they argued that metaphysical system building is, on the one hand, unattainable. Okay, that's not as prominent in the writings, but you do find it there, that they suggest that this is a false hope, the idea that we could somehow one day get to the correct metaphysical system. So this is a misguided approach or goal. But on the other hand, lo and behold, luckily enough, it's not required. Okay, so one can do philosophy, one can even do metaphysics properly, legitimately, and come to justified metaphysical beliefs without building some grand system. You can do it piecemeal in the famous words of Russell. Okay, now there's lots to discuss about what I mean here in saying that it's required according to the idealists and not required according to Russell and Moore. What do we mean required for what? I mean, I've already listed some possibilities, but you might think it's required for understanding, that it's required for knowledge, required for justification, required to be doing metaphysics at all. And you might wonder, why it's required if it is. What underlies that fact? Is there something about metaphysics, whether that's understood as the practice of studying metaphysical questions, or whether that's understood in a more object theoretic way, like there are these set of questions that are out there that make up metaphysics, and that metaphysics itself is is intrinsically systematic. So that there's a whole set of questions there I want to set aside, at least for now. Some of them are addressed in this forthcoming edited collection that I co-edited with Nick Stang called Systematic Metaphysics, Historical and Contemporary Perspectives. It will be in your bookstores in the next few months. Pick up your copy. That is based on the project, David, that started in 2020. So like I said, this has been quite a while. But that was sort of, that's the standard story. Those are the two main positions that you find discussed, to the extent that you find this metaphilosophical question discussed at all these days, which you don't very much. Okay, that's part of the purpose of this book, is to put it back on the philosophical stage. But both of those positions, as we alluded to, are optimistic about the possibility of doing metaphysics, right? They just take different stances on how that is to be done. The idealists would think you can't do it, can't get away with just a fragment or a fragmentary or piecemeal kind of metaphysics, but they think you can do the system building kind. Whereas the analytic philosophers starting in the early 20th century and pretty much throughout held that, yep, you can do it because you can do it in a piecemeal way. But of course, there's room in logical space. There's room in logical space for two more views. But the one that's maybe of more interest is the pessimistic combination of answers to the two questions we were essentially asking as to whether it's required and as to whether it's attainable. So you might think, someone might maintain that system building is both required for whatever it is that we were saying it's required, and also unattainable. You can't, at least we can't, at least maybe finite beings like ourselves can't do that. And so this is how I got to Kierkegaard, because I was actually, and still am, I wouldn't say attracted to this view because I find it very depressing, but it seems to me that it has a lot going for it. Both sides here, saying that it's required and saying it's unattainable, seem to have some pretty good reasons in favor of accepting them. And in engaging this project with other people who knew more than I did about the historical side of things, made me aware of the fact that Kierkegaard was pretty anti-systematic. But they didn't make me aware of the fact that he not only rejected the claim that it was required, but he also did pretty strongly defend the claim that it was unattainable. So in Kierkegaard, you have this combination of views. And I don't know if there are that many other figures in the history of philosophy who endorsed both of those claims. Of course, this invites the question, if you maintain both of these things, where do you go from there, right? Especially if you're a philosopher and you're getting paid to do philosophy. How do you do it, especially if you do metaphysics? But I'm not going to get into that. I'm just going to focus on this combination of views, right? And he doesn't just think these things are true, right? On his view, I'll use K to abbreviate Kierkegaard, metaphysics, at least when we're talking about metaphysics that's based wholly in reason and not in any act of will, okay? So no leap of faith, no use of pragmatic arguments in metaphysics, just trying to figure out, get to the bottom of things and rely on reason. It's actually comic. This is what he says in a number of places about Hegel in particular, and then about others who follow in Hegel's path. And the reason reminds one maybe of certain views of the absurd. It requires doing something that is system completion that is in principle impossible for finite beings like ourselves. So you're sort of trying to do something that just exceeds the capacities of a being such as you are. So that's what he says. Okay, so this is the background now to the official topic. The official topic, right, is Kierkegaard's arguments against objective reasoning in metaphysics. That background will not serve just as background, but also will reappear. Okay, the idea of systematicity is going to play a central role in his arguments against objective reasoning in metaphysics. To get to a discussion of his arguments against objective reasoning in metaphysics, we have to first start with his more famous arguments against objective reasoning in religion. Okay, so Kierkegaard is widely known, at least within circles, philosophy of religion circles. People who are just interested in matters of faith and what faith is and whether it's virtuous or vicious, might be familiar with Kierkegaard's views, and in particular, the views that he develops in this book called, it's a pseudonymous book, okay, written under the pseudonym Johannes Climacus, called Concluding Unscientific Postscript to Philosophical Fragments. So the truth is, there's also a previous book called Philosophical Fragments, which is also relevant to this, but he really gets into his arguments against objective reasoning in religion when he gets to his Concluding Unscientific Postscript, which is much longer than the fragments themselves. And as you can see, my title is really just a takeoff on a title of a well-known paper by Robert Adams about Kierkegaard's arguments against objective reasoning in religion. Okay, he has a paper with that title. And he's examining this work. You don't need Adams to tell you that, if you read this work, it's concerned centrally with the question, is religious commitment the kind of thing that can be properly grounded in objective reasoning? And not just with the question, but with demonstrating a negative answer to that question. Okay, so he thinks it's not the case that religious commitment can be properly grounded solely in objective reasoning, and maybe not in objective reasoning at all, depends on which arguments you're looking at. Right, and this is why, for him, there needs to be a leap of faith, as he would put it, right? Some act of will. Now, I'm using objective reasoning. Just to be clear, this is actually a difference between how I'm reading Kierkegaard and how Adams seems to be reading Kierkegaard. When I'm talking about objective reason, I mean basically theoretical reason, okay? As opposed to, it could be equally publicly available considerations, but as opposed to practical reason. Okay, so it's not as though, again, this is a difference between how I'm reading this and how Adams is reading it. Kierkegaard would say it has to be irrational or can't be justified whatsoever. It's just that if it's going to be justified, it's going to be justified on pragmatic grounds. Okay, so maybe there is some sort of good objective argument in the sense that everyone can appreciate these reasons, but they're going to be reasons of a sort that would justify acceptance, okay, or living that lifestyle, or a commitment to the religion, as opposed to something that's supposed to provide evidential support for the truth of the religion. That's what he is arguing is not possible. Okay, so it's a matter of reason versus the will. Okay, and now as it's usually presented, and when I say usually, I think this is true more or less across the board. It's certainly true in terms of how Adams presents it. The book is concerned even more particularly with whether Christian religious commitments, so that's one specification that I'll ignore, can be properly grounded in objective historical reasoning. Okay, so that's a further specification which I'm not going to ignore, because that's basically, as Adams sees it, what Kierkegaard is really setting himself out to show, right? A negative answer to that question. That there's going to need to be a leap of faith from whatever historical evidence one might have to the Christian conclusion. And then, the more general thesis that, the objective reason is not going to be sufficient, period, when it comes to religion, that's supposed to just somehow follow pretty straightforwardly. Okay. Now, how is it supposed to follow straightforwardly? What Adams says on this is just one line. He says, it is assumed that some belief about historical facts is an essential part of Christian faith. Okay, so that if religious faith cannot be based on objective historical reasoning, then Christian faith cannot be based on objective reasoning at all. So that is his answer to how this is supposed to work, how the global argument is supposed to work, is that there's a certain historical element that is just essential to Christianity, the content of Christianity. And so if there's no way to ground Christian religious commitment in objective historical reasoning, it's supposed to then just follow, more or less trivially, that there's not going to be any way to do it grounded in objective reasoning, period. Okay, I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's true that Kierkegaard just assumed this, okay, that if religious faith cannot be based on objective historical reasoning, then it can't be based on objective reasoning at all. And I don't think it's true that he took that conditional to be justified by the fact that some historical claim is an essential part of the Christian faith. The reason I don't think that's what's going on is that he spends a considerable part of this book, of the Concluding Unscientific Postscript, considering an alternative source of objective reasoning in religion, right? Maybe even equally large part of the book. All right? Not historical evidence, but speculative philosophy, by which he seems to mean metaphysics, and by which he seems to mean actually systematic metaphysics, and arguing that it too cannot serve as a sufficient ground of objective reasoning in religion. Okay, so he's considering that. He spends pages upon pages upon pages arguing that's not possible. Now, his objection to that is not the very straightforward one, right? That doing so would leave out some of the essential historical content of Christian religion. He may in fact think that's true. Okay, that's maybe another argument between him and Hegel. But that's not what he says. Okay, he doesn't base his rejection on that. Rather, what he does is he mounts a series of arguments, and we'll look at them. But it's a series of arguments that parallel, in many ways, the arguments that you have in the historical case, right? Or what he says about historical reasoning. Okay, so it seems like there are going to be lots of differences in the details, but he thinks that for the very same reasons that historical evidence won't suffice to establish the theoretical rationality of commitment to Christianity, metaphysical argument also won't suffice to establish the theoretical rationality of commitment to Christianity. And I think this is prima facie difficult. Okay, it presents a puzzle of sorts, how to understand why Kierkegaard would have thought that. The reason it's prima facie difficult emerges when you look at his reasons for thinking that historical evidence is insufficient. So when you look there are a number of reasons that you can look at Bob Adams' article, where he basically brings three, but two of the most prominent ones are captured by this, that historical evidence is always uncertain and it's always tentative. Okay, so it doesn't decisively settle anything, and it also is always open to revision. That is, what it is that you conclude based on the evidence, you always have to be open to the possibility of revising that. These are closely related, of course, but it creates two different issues. Issues stemming from the fact that religious commitment requires what he calls an infinite interest. You're supposed to be infinitely interested in this, otherwise it's not a genuinely religious commitment. And then the bottom line is, or the tension, according to Kierkegaard, is that an infinite interest can never be objectively justified by evidence that is uncertain. That's what Adams calls the approximation argument, and or tentative, which is what he calls the postponement argument. Okay, it can't be that it's going to be something that you're kind of hedging your bets about. It also can't be the kind of thing that you're always postponing and waiting on. That's not consistent with an infinite interest. But now, what's interesting, the puzzle is that it doesn't seem like these are the kinds of things, right, these issues of approximation and postponement shouldn't be the kinds of things that arise regarding metaphysical argument or evidence. Right? There seems to be at least a fundamental prima facie difference between historical evidence, empirical evidence more generally, and the kind of evidence one gets in metaphysics. Right? So metaphysical evidence, if it's to be had, seems to be the kind of thing, that's certainly what all of his interlocutors would have thought, that is both certain and final. Right? So it establishes this with certainty, and also it's the final word. You don't have to be open to being refuted. All right, and so that's at least what his interlocutors would have thought, and that's why I think it's somewhat puzzling that he doesn't do very much to explain, okay, why it is that when it comes to metaphysics we can expect the same thing. But that's only if you ignore a possibility I think does emerge when you sort of read this carefully and think about the historical case and the metaphysical case. The answer, I think, is that on Kierkegaard's view, the uncertainty and tentativeness is internal to metaphysics itself. Right? So the solution here is that metaphysical evidence, if it were to be had, would be certain and final. Right? But it's not to be had, at least not based on objective reasoning alone, for the reason that it is both uncertain and tentative. Okay? And that requires that uncertainty and that tentativeness within metaphysics, and I'll have to explain what that means much more, which we'll do over the next 10 minutes, hopefully, is what precludes metaphysics from serving as a proper basis for commitment to religion, because you're going to have a leap of faith even before you get to the end of the metaphysics. So when it comes to historical evidence, things are slightly different. The leap of faith is from the historical evidence to the religious conclusion. In the case of metaphysics, there's still a leap of faith, but the leap of faith that's going to have to happen is even earlier in the process. It's within metaphysics itself. There's going to have to be some leap, and then once you do that, you can have a complete metaphysical system upon which you might ground religious commitment, and legitimately so, but the act of will that happened along the way infects, so to speak, what happens subsequently, in the sense that you can't view that religious commitment as being based on theoretical reason or objective reasoning alone. So even in metaphysics, there's a need for a leap of faith. And this is what he says. Okay, so I'm not using this term, I'm not borrowing this term from his discussion of religion, of history. This is what he says a number of times, even when he's just discussing straight up speculative philosophy as a possible ground. Okay, that was a sketch, or I don't even know if a sketch of a solution. That was, the broad, very broad outlines of the bottom line, I suppose. But how do we get there? I mean, why does he think that's so? So here's the structure of the argument as I see it. Okay, the structure of the argument is, you can break it down further if you want, but basically you can present it with just two premises. The first premise having to do with whether there can be theoretical justification in accepting a fragment of a metaphysical system. The second premise having to do with whether there can be theoretical justification in accepting an entire metaphysical system. And each premise rules out the relevant kind of justification. Okay, so the first premise says no one, period. Okay, this is not just no one finite. No one can ever be theoretically justified in accepting a mere fragment of a metaphysical system. And two, no one, at least no one finite, no one like ourselves, okay, think as opposed to some being that's outside of time or God or whatnot. No one finite can ever be theoretically justified in accepting an entire metaphysical system, right? So, it doesn't formally follow, but it seems that those are the only two options, either a fragment or an entire thing. I'm sure I'm missing some formal possibility out there in logical space, but it seems like it follows that no one finite can ever be theoretically justified in accepting any metaphysics at all. I'm never good on time, so I'm gonna, choose judiciously what to mention here. So when it comes to the first premise, the truth is, this wasn't much of an issue at the time, right? This wasn't really an issue. The requirement of systematicity wasn't actually a point of contention between Kierkegaard and the people he took to be his interlocutors, right? He was attacking, more or less, the Hegelians, right, who agreed that you can't get away with just a fragment of a metaphysical system. It has to be the whole kit and caboodle if this is going to be something you're justified in believing. And so he doesn't really spend much time arguing for this, right? That being said, you might make some attributions. So there's an article by Merold Westphal called Climacus on Subjectivity in the System, where he claims that Kierkegaard is following Hegel and then Bradley and many of the idealists in thinking that it's actually required for the very intelligibility of the fragment that you claim to be endorsing. Right? That is, you won't understand anything until you understand everything. And they literally mean you won't understand it, right? So it's not some sort of very, maybe it's somewhat deep, but the point is you're really missing something very basic. It's not like some sort of epistemic add-on. It's that you won't even understand what your theory is saying because of their very holistic and monistic conception of reality. Okay, so everything is related to everything, which means that you can't understand anything without understanding everything. I don't see that in Kierkegaard. Doesn't mean he doesn't accept it. I do think probably if you can find anything in Kierkegaard on this, what you find is just that he thinks that having a complete system rather than just a fragment is required for justified unconditional acceptance. Okay, so if you want to not just accept this, but accept whatever it is that you're believing as your metaphysical thesis unconditionally, you can't do that short of having an entire system that settles all questions. And the reason I think he thinks this is true is because he thinks that, like Aaron Segal does in a number of papers, that no fragment of metaphysics or philosophy in general is sufficiently isolated, whether that's dialectically or logically or probabilistically, evidentially, however you want to go there, from the remainder, such that it would be true come what may regarding that remainder. Right? The idea is you can't find some sort of proper part of the whole of metaphysics, some set of questions, and say like, well, I can just address those and forget about the rest of the metaphysical questions. This claim is supposed to be a generalization of, I think, a very commonplace, a phenomenon that should be completely evident to anyone who has ever engaged in, serious metaphysics or philosophy. One thing leads to another. It's hardly possible, to start doing or addressing the question of personal identity without then addressing questions about human ontology, which is then not really possible to do without addressing questions of composition and persistence, which in turn require answering certain questions about temporal passage, and so on and so on. Arguing or making this claim precise and then arguing for it is what I try to do in those papers. But the idea is supposed to be pretty intuitive. And I think to the extent that you find something in Kierkegaard that suggests an argument, it is something along these lines, right? He's saying, if you want to be content with, if you sleep on it until tomorrow, you may well say that, then that's fine, right? But if you want to say something unconditional, that's just not going to be possible short of having an entire system. Okay, now I'll leave this aside. I think we should just note that in the context of the broader argument, he doesn't even have to go any further than that. That would be sufficient. I do think he thinks that unconditional acceptance is sort of a sine qua non for doing metaphysics properly. So if you're not really doing metaphysics, if what you're doing is endorsing things conditionally or hesitatingly, I think it's probably connected to a conception of metaphysics that has to do with getting to ultimate reality. Okay, but in any case, I don't think that's really critical here. The point is, even the qualified premise about it just not being unconditionally justified would be sufficient for his overall argument. Right? Again, his overall argument regarding whether you can ground commitment to religion in an objective way, through objective reasoning, in metaphysics. Okay, that's regarding the first premise. Regarding the second premise, okay, he says this in no small number of places. He says this all over the place, that no one finite can ever be theoretically justified in accepting an entire metaphysical system. That's only for God. Okay, he quotes Lessing very approvingly here in saying that that's really something that only an infinite being could do. Okay, he spends a lot of time mocking Hegelian pretensions to do that. Again, we have his claim that this is in fact comic. It's like a joke. Now, why does he think this? Why does he think that it's impossible for finite beings to attain a metaphysical system? So I think you can actually extract at least 3 arguments, maybe more. I'm sure if I read more carefully and slowly, I'd find more. But I think there are at least 3 which have you can think through sort of different ways in which finitude would be relevant. So one way in which it would be relevant would just be, well, we're finite beings means that we have a finite amount of time. We're pretty limited in how many things we can cover in the short life that we have. And on the other hand, there are an infinite number of metaphysical questions. Okay, he says things to this effect, and you might think that's not wholly implausible. That if you really thought about it and you were really willing to think with a fine-tooth comb about metaphysical questions, you could actually find an infinite number. Right? I don't think he should be worried or too worked up about the fact, that maybe someone could complete a super task. Maybe they discuss one issue and then the next issue they complete in half the amount of time it took them to discuss the first issue, and within an hour they've completed all of metaphysics, right? I mean, because the finitude is not just supposed to be about how much time we have, but also, I presume, it's supposed to relate to things like our capacities to complete super tasks. But I do think he should worry about whether this is just an artifact of a particular level of granularity, right, with which we're dividing up the terrain of metaphysics. Okay, so sure, I can find a way to divide up metaphysics and philosophy more generally into a number of questions that is in fact infinite, but the much more relevant and interesting question is whether I can also divide it into a finite number of questions or topics such that each of them is tractable in its own right. Right? If that were the case, then our finitude would be no obstacle to, in fact, having a metaphysical system. Okay, we could just do each one of these, assuming we could work fast enough. I mean, there still might be a huge number. Okay, that might be an obstacle given how long we actually live and how slow we work. But this isn't an in-principle point. He wants to make a very strong in-principle claim. So I think that's a problem with that argument. The second argument here is even weirder and worse, but he definitely endorses it, I think. And that is that here the finitude has to do with the fact that we don't see the end of history. So it also has to do with the fact that we're finite creatures in time, okay? But the point is history unfolds after us, each and every one of us, individually at least, and for any given time in history, even the collective that's lived until then, right? So what he argues, what he claims is that the correct metaphysical system has implications regarding the whole of history, that is, even times after when we live, and so it remains open to refutation, just like a historical conjecture remains open to refutation because it's empirical. So in this way, even metaphysical claims in a metaphysical system, they have implications downstream historically. And one day we might discover something, we could discover something that will just show the metaphysical system is false. Okay, my objection to this is that I think it's a very peculiar conception of metaphysics, maybe even a peculiar conception of history or both, that would have this result, right? Because my worry is not that metaphysics can't have implications for how history goes. It could be, I mean, some have argued that there are metaphysical questions that are themselves contingent. The answers are contingent. Even if that's not the case, if they're all necessary, even necessary truths obviously have implications for how actuality is. Okay, so it's not the fact that it has implications for how history goes. What bothers me is that metaphysics, even if it traffics in some contingent claims, is still supposed to be operating at a very high level of generality. And I would think that the level of generality in which it's operating is such that any implications it has for concrete goings-on throughout history should already have been discovered, right? The kinds of things, like maybe it has implications for what the laws are. If the nature of lawhood has implications for what the laws are, right, we might see some way of empirically testing those metaphysical claims. But again, that's going to be something that we'll already have uncovered. Okay, now, I don't know. The world is a strange place, and maybe we will, in fact, at some point uncover something that is, in fact, relevant. But he seems pretty adamant that he's very confident that this is actually a very live possibility, rather than just like, well, for all we know, this might happen. Okay, I know I'm already 3 minutes over, but I do want to put out the argument that I think is actually the most promising. Okay, that's the following. So I think he thinks the problem with attaining a metaphysical system that you can be justified in believing on reason, on the basis of reason alone, isn't that reason can never bring metaphysical system building to a close or to an end because of our finitude. It's rather our finitude means that we're in time period, which means that the way that we develop metaphysical systems is over time, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there's some beginning, there's some place we started. And the problem here is that reason can never properly reassure you that there wasn't something amiss about where you began your system building. So you start wherever you start, okay, like as an actual human. So this may not be how Hegel wrote his works, okay, in terms of like what appears in order in the works he has. But he was a human being who started somewhere. And trivially, wherever it is that you actually started your metaphysical system building, it's always going to be the case that you started there, at least, this is the critical point, at least so long as the chain of reasoning doesn't break, right? At least so long as you haven't stopped the reasoning and then moved to something that doesn't follow based on reason alone. Okay, but on the other hand, reason won't allow you to ever conclude that that starting point of yours was either justified or eliminable, by which I mean that even if you had started elsewhere, you still would have justifiably ended up where you did. Why? Okay, maybe it's not so hard to see, right? The point is, you're never going to be able to just see that fact. Like, behold, oh, that beginning was eliminable. Right? That's very difficult for finite beings like ourselves. Same thing with just the immediate justification of that beginning. So what's the alternative? The alternative is to reason your way to that conclusion. Okay, whatever further reasoning you're going to engage in, so long as it involves no leap or resolution on your part, is going to just continue to invite the same question of whether the starting point was justified or eliminable. Okay, and I think you could put this more carefully in terms of whether you have a non-question begging argument here for the conclusion that you are in fact justified in starting where you started, or that it was eliminable. Okay, we could talk about that if you want. But what's the upshot? So you might say, Aaron, you're confusing levels, or Kierkegaard, you're confusing levels, right? So what if you can't argue in a non-question begging way to the conclusion that your starting point is justified or eliminable? At most, what that would preclude you from being justified in believing is that you're justified in believing X, Y, Z, whatever it is, the first order parts of the system. It doesn't preclude you in actually being justified in believing X, Y, Z. So nothing he has said, it seems, right, would rule out the possibility that you just do this, you start from wherever you start, and if you got lucky enough, or, you know, I don't know, maybe it doesn't depend on luck, but if things turned out that way, then you would in fact be justified, even if you can't show on the basis of reason that you are justified. But here I think is the kicker, right? It's where Kierkegaard makes a very important point. We're not just talking about establishing anything whatsoever based on reason. We're talking about establishing a metaphysical system or a philosophical system more generally, which, if it's a system, is going to have to be comprehensive. It's going to have to take a view on everything, including the question of whether the rest of the system can be justifiably believed. And that's always going to be elusive. So that piece is never going to be something that you can justifiably believe. Okay, so I probably should have had some other kind of conclusion, but I thought I would let Kierkegaard speak for himself, right? And this is the larger frame of a quote we saw earlier. He says, what if rather than speaking or dreaming of an absolute beginning, we speak of a leap? Then at the end, Lessing was no speculative philosopher. Therefore, he assumed the opposite of what Hegel assumes, that an infinitely little distance makes the ditch infinitely broad, because the leap itself makes the ditch that broad, the idea being that the fact that you have to take a leap of faith within metaphysics makes the ditch infinitely broad, because you're now moving from reason to the use of will, which is an entirely different genus. So that's all.